Hi, everybody. Good morning. Today we'll be learning about our next immigrant family, the Saez-Velez family, who immigrated from Puerto Rico to New York City. Students will be engaging in their usual opening do now warm-up routine. Students will be introduced to two new academic vocabulary words, the word inequity and the word persuade. Teachers can continue to use the word knowledge building matrix chart as they dive deeper into the meanings of these words, such as the word inequity, and to talk about the differences between inequity and inequality. Students will also be learning about the important academic vocabulary word persuade and bias, as students start to consider the biases immigrants faced, and in order to persuade people, to convince people when they're writing persuasively or argumentatively. Students will engage in a before reading poem, the famous poem Puerto Rican Obituary, written by Pedro Pietri. Here's a link that will take you to a YouTube video, and you can see Pedro Pietri reading from his poem. It will also be helpful to provide the text of the poem so students could follow along. It's up to the teachers how much of the poem they want to use in class. You could use as little as the first verse or two, the first stanza or two, or you could use it the entire poem, which is a very interesting poem that many of my students regularly enjoy. In the video adapted resources folder, there's English and Spanish versions of the poem, as well as questions for the students to work on to help them build their reading comprehension skills and to engage in additional discussion. It's important that students answer question number 3 because they'll be using that question in their after reading activity. The purpose of today's lesson is to let's read today's text closely to see how the central theme of migration impacted the Saez-Velez family as they moved from Puerto Rico to New York City. There'll be the usual protocols for engaging it with the text. There's an audio recording available, as well as a direct link to the text. It may also be helpful again to once again review the vocabulary word bias. As we see in the poem, and as we connect with the experiences of the Saez-Velez family, there was bias against immigrants that they faced in school and in the workplace that sort of prevented them from reaching their full potential in New York City. After the reading, students will be revising and adding to and building on their response to question number 3 from the before reading activity. And once again, there's a number of closing and connecting activities for students to engage with. Now let's jump right into today's lesson. Can somebody please read today's essential question? Good. How do communities evidence and overcome inequities? Good. It's important to have students understand what inequities mean and the subtle difference between inequity and inequality. Sometimes you have to provide additional support to people so that they could become more equitable, so that there's more equity. Which, even though people might not be treated equally, you want them to be treated equitably. So it may mean giving some people extra support or extra help when they need it. Can somebody please read the 2 lesson objectives for today? Good. To identify evidence that supports a conclusion taken from a text. Good. Students are going to start to practice using text evidence to support their conclusions. The second one says, to analyze the development of the central idea or theme in a text. Good. Students are going to see reoccurring examples of a theme or of a central idea, both in the poem and in the nonfiction text as well. Let's look at our opening do now. We see a map. What do you see? What do you think? What do you wonder? Students may say, I see a map that shows the United States, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. I think it is showing where people immigrate to America from. I wonder why so many immigrants move to New York. Okay. Here we can see another map of the Saez-Velez family's journey from Puerto Rico to New York City. Now students could engage in the before reading activity where they watch the YouTube video as well as follow along with the poem, the Puerto Rican obituary. At this point, you could pause this video and jump into the text. After reading, students' after reading activity will be to revise their response to number 3 from the before reading activity by adding more details to the Velez family's experiences of migrating to New York City. It may be helpful to create a Google document for students where they can keep track of all their work for the week and then use these responses when working on the day 5 final assignment. It may be helpful also to model a writing strategy for students when using text evidence. I know there's a number of different strategies, but it may be helpful to model something like this. Statement, evidence, explanation is called a C response. Students can make a statement, and then they could provide text evidence, as well as then explain the evidence that they use. Okay, so after completing that activity, students can then engage in the closing and connecting activities. One interesting activity is to ask students to picture. They can look at this picture of the Lower East Side at the time and try to predict how the Saez-Velez family may have felt in this neighborhood based on what they see in the picture. Okay. Now you guys can jump right into today's lesson and begin with the before reading activity.